In the summer of 1903, the small mining town of Ashford Hollow sat cradled between the dark ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where coal dust blackened the lungs and superstition weighed as heavily as the soot in the air. At the farthest edge of the town, where the narrow road dissolved into forest, stood an enormous wrought iron gate, ornate, rusted, and impossibly heavy. No record told who built it or why it had been planted in a place that led nowhere. The people simply called it the Iron Gate, and as long as anyone could remember, they avoided it. In 1903, the hills of West Virginia were alive with the grinding weight of industry, though the small town of Ashford Hollow remained isolated enough to feel almost forgotten by the modern world. It was a coal town, one of hundreds that dotted the Appalachian valleys, where families built their lives in shacks blackened by soot, and men trudged daily into the earth's maw with picks, lamps, and lungs already half choked with dust. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a heaviness, a combination of industry and wilderness. For beyond the thin stretch of road that marked the edge of town loomed a wilderness both magnificent and foreboding. Towering oaks and dense underbrush encircled Ashford Hollow like a living wall, and though the miners cut deep into the earth, they never ventured far into those woods without reason. It was said that the land resisted settlement, that every fence post or stone foundation built too far into the tree line quickly crumbled or was swallowed by creeping vines. To the locals, the forest was not a place of leisure but of whispered warnings, a boundary marked by silence. At the heart of this uneasy balance between industry and wilderness stood the Iron Gate. It was an oddity in every sense, massive, ornate and immovable, set into the ground at the farthest edge of the town where no road continued and no destination lay beyond. Constructed of black wrought iron, the gate was formed of twisting bars and elaborate scrollwork that seemed too fine, too deliberate, for a settlement so poor. It stretched higher than two men stacked upon one another, with posts buried so deep in the soil that no attempt to move it had ever succeeded. The iron was mottled with rust, though even in its decay it held a strange dignity, like the ruin of something once majestic. Children would sometimes dare one another to touch it, but the older townsfolk crossed themselves and walked in wide arcs to avoid its presence. No one alive in Ashford Hollow could recall its construction, and no ledger, church record, or county archive spoke of who ordered its creation. To the people who lived in its shadow, the Iron Gate was not a passage but a warning, a line drawn by hands long gone. The setting of Ashford Hollow itself magnified the strangeness of the gate. Nestled between two ridges that seemed to lean inward like watchful sentinels, the town felt perpetually hemmed in. Fog would roll through the valley and linger for days, clinging to roofs and winding its way into the mine shafts until lamps barely pierced the thickness. The dirt roads turned to sucking mud each time the rain swept down from the mountains, and the river that wound nearby was known for its unpredictable swells, sometimes rising overnight to swallow fences, livestock, even the edge of a barn. The environment itself seemed to reinforce the sense that Ashford Hollow was a place people were not meant to remain for long. Yet families stayed, tied by necessity to the coal seam that provided their meager living, tethered by debts to the company store, and by roots too deep to be torn up easily. Life in 1903 was grueling. Men woke before dawn, their wives packing tins of bread and meat for the shafts, children often barefoot in the dust. Sundays offered the only reprieve, when the wooden church bell rang hollowly through the valley and hymns rose to echo against the ridges. Yet even those gatherings held an air of restraint, as though no song or prayer could fully shake the weight of the land pressing in on them. Superstition thrived here. The older generation spoke of signs in the smoke, of warnings carried on the cry of owls, of shadows moving between the trees. Faith and fear existed side by side, each reinforcing the other so that no one ever felt safe enough to mock the stories whispered at night. The Iron Gate wove itself into these superstitions. Some said it marked the boundary of land once owned by a forgotten family, a wealthy dynasty that built the barrier to keep trespassers from wandering into their estate. Others whispered that it had no earthly function at all, that it was built to contain something rather than keep it out. Children were hushed when they asked about it, and the elders only shook their heads as though remembering things they dared not put into words. Even the miners, men hardened by danger and collapse, spoke of hearing strange echoes when working the seams closest to the gate's direction. Their picks would strike stone and carry a sound that seemed too hollow, as if the mountain were not solid but empty, a cavernous chamber just beneath their feet. The setting of this town, remote and self-contained, made every anomaly loom larger. There were no neighboring towns within an easy ride, no rail line to bring news or visitors with regularity. Ashford Hollow lived and breathed by its own rhythms, and anything out of place became magnified into legend. When the iron gate stood silent, it was merely an object of curiosity, a relic that blended into the background like the skeletal remains of an old barn. But when the stillness of the valley was broken, when the people of Ashford Hollow would later swear they heard what no community should ever hear together, the iron gate transformed from forgotten ironwork into something else entirely. The Appalachian setting only deepened the sense of isolation and fear. The ridges blocked more than just storms. They blocked the world beyond. Even the sky felt narrower, framed by peaks so close that the stars seemed to cluster unnaturally tight above the town. Lanterns cast only small islands of light, and beyond them lay a darkness thick enough to drown in. Travelers passing through, rare as they were, often remarked that Ashford Hollow felt older than the rest of the country, as if time itself slowed when one stepped into the valley. They said the buildings leaned inward, the air pressed heavier, and the silence carried a weight that lingered in the chest long after leaving. For the residents, though, that silence was simply life, and in such silence, every sound, every creak of timber, every sigh of wind through the forest, took on new meaning. The stage, then, was set long before the first scream was ever heard. Ashford Hollow in 1903 was a place of isolation, superstition, and unease, where every element of the setting seemed to conspire to remind its people of their fragility. The iron gate, looming at the edge of the town with no road and no purpose, embodied this unease better than anything else. It was a relic of unknown origin, an object that defied explanation in a town that could barely afford nails for its own repairs, and its presence stood as a constant reminder that something beyond the ordinary might be waiting in the dark. The iron gate stood like a relic out of place and out of time, a monument that no one in Ashford Hollow could explain, yet none dared to ignore. Its presence was as much a part of the town's identity as the mine shafts or the clapboard houses, though it belonged to no man, no company, and no memory. Rising high above the surrounding brush, the gate was made of black wrought iron, thick bars twisted into designs that suggested both artistry and menace. Curves spiraled into unfamiliar shapes, some resembling vines, others like flames frozen in metal. The center held a circular emblem, though weather and rust had obscured its details. Some claimed to see a crest, others a snarling face. Its surface was rough with age, yet even through corrosion, it carried the impression of craftsmanship beyond what a poor coal town could ever have afforded. It was not merely a gate, but a declaration, though of what no one could ever agree. It stood in isolation at the very edge of Ashford Hollow, where the narrow road simply ended. On one side of it stretched the last of the homes and the rutted path miners used to haul carts. On the other, only wilderness, a wall of trees, thorn-choked brush, and ground that quickly sloped into a tangle of ridges and gullies. No fence extended from the gate, no wall embraced it, no structure suggested it once belonged to an estate or boundary. It was a door without a destination, guarding nothing yet commanding presence. Travelers who stumbled upon it remarked on its oddity, often with unease, as though it were the ruin of a civilization swallowed by time, a leftover piece of a story never told. The people of Ashford Hollow treated it with wary reverence. Children were warned not to play near it, though curiosity always lured them to its shadow. The bravest would slip their small fingers through the bars, daring each other to cross to the other side. They spoke in hushed tones of the way the air grew cooler when one stepped past the threshold, of the silence that seemed heavier, as if the forest beyond pressed back against intruders. On summer nights, when the fireflies floated in clouds and the woods buzzed with life, the area around the iron gate often stood strangely quiet, as though the usual chorus of crickets and cicadas stopped at its border. Mothers would scold their children for lingering too long there, telling them stories meant to frighten but built from the quiet dread the adults themselves carried. No one knew who built it. Old records of the county, thin and inconsistent, made no mention of its construction. Families who had lived in Ashford Hollow since before the Civil War swore it had always been there, as fixed as the ridges themselves. Some claimed it was erected by land barons before the town even existed, men with wealth enough to order such elaborate ironwork. Others whispered it was the mark of something older still, a remnant of settlers who vanished, or perhaps a signal left by people who walked the land long before Americans called it theirs. These explanations, however, were never given with confidence, for even those who spoke them knew they rang hollow. The miners who passed it daily on their way to work held their own opinions. Men hardened by long days underground were not easily rattled, yet many admitted to unease in its presence. They said the iron itself seemed to hum faintly when struck, as though some deep resonance lived inside it. Some swore they heard echoes near it, strange reverberations that did not match the shape of the land. A few avoided even looking at it, preferring to keep their eyes fixed on the ground as they trudged past in the early hours. For a people used to constant danger, where roof collapses and gas leaks claimed lives without warning, the Iron Gate felt like another kind of hazard, one less physical but no less real. The local preacher often invoked it in sermons, though never directly. He spoke of barriers between the righteous and the wicked, between the known and the unknown, and though he never named the Iron Gate, his congregation understood the illusion. On more than one occasion, he warned of thresholds never meant to be crossed, of lines drawn not by man but by God himself. Parishioners nodded solemnly, glancing toward the edge of town as if expecting the great black shape of the gate to loom through the church walls. The implication was clear. It was not theirs to move, not theirs to question, only theirs to avoid. Visitors who came to Ashford Hollow, traders, drifters, or men sent by the mining company, often asked about it. Their questions, sometimes posed casually, sometimes with genuine curiosity, were always met with shrugs and evasions. "It's always been there," the townsfolk would reply, or "ain't nothing beyond it worth going for." If pressed further, they grew silent, lips pressed thin, eyes darting away. The gate was both a curiosity and a taboo, and speaking of it too openly seemed to give it power. Outsiders laughed, dismissed it as rustic superstition, yet often left with a lingering chill after seeing it for themselves. The Iron Gate carried a sense of contradiction. It was beautiful, with ironwork so intricate it might have belonged to a grand estate, yet it stood in a place of hardship and dust. It was permanent, rooted in soil so firmly that storms, floods, and years of neglect had not toppled it, yet it seemed fragile too, corroded and stained, as though one day it might crumble to nothing. It was isolated, leading nowhere, yet it exerted influence over everyone in the town, shaping their fears, their legends, their silences. Its very uselessness made it powerful, for things without purpose demand explanation, and in the absence of one, people supply their own. Rumors swirled around its origins, each more unsettling than the last. Some whispered it had been built to mark a grave too large for a man, that beneath the soil lay something chained and waiting. Others claimed it was part of a larger structure now vanished, the rest of its walls swallowed by the forest long ago. A few said it was never meant for Ashford Hollow at all, that it was carried there piece by piece, dragged through the mountains to stand exactly where it stood, as if its placement had been chosen with deliberate care. These stories were told in low voices, most often at night, when firelight flickered and shadows seemed to crawl, when the silence outside the windows felt deeper and more oppressive. The most unsettling belief was one that went largely unspoken, but weighed heavily in the collective imagination of Ashford Hollow, that the Iron Gate was not built to keep people out, but to keep something in. The absence of any road leading up to it, the sheer absurdity of its placement seemed to support the notion. Why else build such a barrier in the middle of nowhere, so solid, so permanent, if not to serve as a lock? Children who dared to step past its bars sometimes swore they felt eyes on them, as if the trees themselves shifted in watchfulness. Adults brushed these tales aside but never dismissed them completely, for deep down, even they felt the same unease when the night grew too still and the moonlight cast the gate's shadow long across the dirt. It was in the height of summer, when the nights were thick with humidity and even the cicadas seemed to drone slower, that Ashford Hollow was first pierced by the sound. The town had fallen into its usual silence, the miners exhausted from long hours underground, their wives slipping into restless sleep beside them, children curled against the heat in narrow beds. The air was heavy, the kind that clung to the lungs and made every breath feel weighted. Lamps had been snuffed, shutters drawn, and the only noises were the faint groan of the river current and the occasional creak of timber settling under its own age. It was the kind of silence the town had known for generations, unbroken, predictable, the fragile cocoon that gave them some illusion of peace. That night, however, it fractured with a scream. It began suddenly, without warning, erupting from the direction of the iron gate. It was a sound so violent, so raw, that it rattled wooden shutters on their hinges and made the dogs in the street erupt into panicked howls. The pitch was high, unearthly, drawn out in a way that no human lungs should have been able to sustain. To some it was the cry of a woman, shrill and ragged, torn straight from the gut. To others it carried a different tone, something distorted, like a chorus of voices overlapping in anguish until they blended into one ceaseless wail. The noise was not muffled by the distance of the forest, but instead seemed to spread, as though carried on unseen wires that strung themselves over every rooftop, burrowing directly into the ears of every sleeper until they woke in terror. Windows opened and lanterns flickered to life across the narrow dirt lanes, each glow revealing startled faces peering out into the night. Mothers clutched their children, pulling them back from the glass even as they strained to listen. Men staggered into the street, shirts unbuttoned, rifles in hand, their eyes darting to their neighbors in the glow of kerosene lamps. They did not need to ask where the sound was coming from. They all knew. The iron gate was the direction every face turned toward, though the heavy darkness concealed it beyond the ridges and trees. The scream carried on, rising and falling in waves that seemed to claw at the very air, and for long minutes the town stood frozen, bound by a sound no one could bear, yet none could escape. What made the moment so searing was not only the volume or the pitch, but the sheer inescapability of it. There was nowhere in Ashford Hollow one could retreat to find silence. Inside or out, behind closed doors, or standing in the open, the scream seemed to exist in the bones of the valley itself, vibrating through timber and soil. Those who lived through it would later say it felt as if the sound came from underneath them, from the earth's own marrow. A voice released from caverns older than memory. More than one person crossed themselves instinctively, while others stood rigid, muttering prayers under their breath in fractured rhythm with the howling. Children cried openly, clinging to their mothers' skirts, their sobs swallowed by the unending wail that still stretched over the ridges. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The silence that followed was almost worse. The town remained in the street, neighbors staring at one another with pale faces, too shaken to speak, too afraid to move first. The dogs stopped howling, their tails tucked low, whimpering as though scolded by some unseen master. Only when the first rooster crowed, confused and early, did people begin to retreat indoors, locking doors though no thief had come, drawing curtains though nothing could be seen. Not a soul in Ashford Hollow slept the remainder of the night, each listening to the echo of the scream that still seemed to thrum faintly in their ears, like a memory pressed too deep to shake off. By morning, the story had spread as if carried on the smoke from kitchen fires. Each retelling shifted slightly, sharpened by fear. Some insisted the scream was a woman's, clear as day, perhaps someone being murdered in the woods. Others swore it was no woman at all but a child, the pitch too small, too shrill for anything else. Still others said it was not one voice but many, a cacophony of suffering layered so tightly together it became a single wail. No two people agreed, and yet all admitted to hearing it. Unlike most legends that begin as whispers and doubts, this was unanimous. Not one resident of Ashford Hollow slept through it. Not one denied it happened. It was a shared nightmare, an event etched into collective memory in an instant. The mine foreman, a man of little patience for stories, claimed it was nothing more than a wildcat or panther, but when pressed he had no answer for why such an animal would sound as though it cried in words, or why its voice carried with unnatural force across the whole valley. Others tried to explain it as the shriek of the wind, though the night had been still and heavy without so much as a branch stirring. These explanations, spoken half-heartedly in the light of day, failed to take root. Everyone knew in their own unspoken way that what they had heard did not belong to the ordinary world. Some of the older residents recalled earlier oddities, strange noises whispered about in passing years ago but never shared widely. A woman spoke of hearing faint crying once long ago while hanging laundry at dusk. A miner remembered his father saying the hills sometimes carried voices when storms gathered far off. But never had it come with such force, never had it been so undeniable. Whatever had been whispered about before had been dismissed. explained away as imagination. The scream of that July night, however, refused to be explained, for too many ears had been witness and too many hearts had been rattled to their core. That morning, men gathered in small clusters in the street, rifles slung over shoulders, boots coated in dust. There was talk of searching the woods near the iron gate, though none were eager to lead the way. The women watched from porches, clutching children close, their faces tight with fear but their voices stern, demanding their husbands find the source. Whispers circled quickly. Perhaps a lost traveler had stumbled into the woods, perhaps someone had been injured or worse. Yet beneath these rational guesses lingered something darker. Each person, whether they admitted it or not, carried the suspicion that what they had heard was not human at all, and if they sought it, they might find something they wished had stayed hidden. That first night's scream was the opening of a wound, a tearing of the valley's silence that could not be stitched back shut. It marked the moment Ashford Hollow shifted from superstition into terror, when the iron gate was no longer a curiosity, but a source of dread. For though the sound had ceased, its memory lingered, and in that memory, each resident knew, deep down, that the silence would not hold for long. The memory of the first scream had not yet faded when the second came, and with it, Ashford Hollow's fragile attempts at explanation crumbled. 2 nights after the valley was shaken awake, the town once again lay in uneasy silence. Men had gone about their days pretending at normalcy, swinging picks in the shafts, coughing coal dust into rags, avoiding the subject with forced laughter. Yet every eye carried the same shadow. Every conversation faltered when the iron gate's direction was mentioned. When night fell again, families lingered longer by their lamps, unwilling to snuff the light too soon, ears pricked for a sound they prayed would not return. And then, just as the moon rose above the ridges, the screams began again, this time sharper, louder, and joined by others. At first it was a single cry, ragged and drawn, rising from the same direction as before. But as the town stirred, shutters opening, boots pounding against the dirt, the sound changed. It layered. 1 became 2, 2 became several, until it seemed a crowd of unseen throats wailed together in some discordant chorus. It was not harmony, but chaos. Voices climbing over one another, some shrill, some guttural, all carrying the same edge of pain. The noise spread across the valley, pouring into every house and filling every corner of silence. Children woke screaming, their cries swallowed by the greater wail outside, and mothers clutched them tight, unable to hush them over the noise. Those who dared to listen more closely swore the voices shifted in form as the minutes stretched on. One moment it was a woman's sobs, broken and gasping. The next it was the high, piercing tone of a child in distress. Others insisted they heard men shouting, though the words were strangled, stretched, impossible to decipher. To some it sounded like pleading, to others like rage. The uncertainty of what they were hearing unsettled the townsfolk more than anything else, for the human mind seeks pattern, seeks meaning, and when neither could be found, only fear remained. Neighbors gathered again in the street, but this time there was less shouting, less frantic searching for explanations. No man dared to pretend it was a wildcat now, nor could the wind be blamed when every gustless branch stood still under the starlight. Lanterns glowed in trembling hands, rifles hung slack at sides, but no one took a step toward the iron gate. It was as though an invisible wall held them, as though the screams themselves forbade approach. Instead, they stood together in mute witness, each face pale, each set of eyes locked in shared terror, as though drawing strength from the mere fact of not facing it alone. The voices rose higher still, their tones warping until they seemed to scrape against the mind itself. More than one woman fainted in the street, collapsing into the arms of her neighbors, overcome by the sheer violence of the sound. A miner dropped his rifle in the dirt and clapped his hands over his ears, shouting wordlessly as though trying to drown it out. And then, as abruptly as before, the cries cut off, leaving only the panting breath of a town too shaken to speak. By morning, speculation raged. Some clung to rational guesses, insisting perhaps a family had been lost in the woods, their cries mistaken for something greater by the echo of the ridges. But even as they spoke it, doubt clouded their eyes. The woods had been combed after the first scream. Men had tramped through the brush with lanterns, searching for any trace of an intruder, and they had found nothing but broken branches and a strange odor of sulfur. If there were travelers or vagrants, why had they not appeared by daylight? Why had they not sought help, shelter, or even food? Others argued more darkly. They said the voices were not living, but dead. Miners buried alive in shafts long collapsed, their spirits clawing against the earth, their agony still echoing through the hills. The children, ever more honest in their fears, spoke plainly what adults hesitated to say. They said the voices were not cries at all, but invitations, as though something beyond the gate was calling, beckoning them closer. Some swore they understood words hidden in the noise, though none agreed on what those words were. A few claimed the voices called their names, spoken softly between the screams, and these children shivered even in the daylight, clinging to their mothers' skirts with eyes wide and sleepless. The preacher delivered a sermon that Sunday unlike any before, thundering about judgment and unholy spirits, warning that the Lord often tested his people through trials of sound and vision. He urged the town to remain steadfast, to resist temptation, to shut their ears against the devil's tricks. Yet his voice cracked as he spoke, his knuckles white against the pulpit, betraying his own fear. After the service, when questioned privately, he admitted no passage of Scripture had prepared him for such a thing. He too had heard the screams, had felt them reverberate through his very marrow, and though he urged others to stand firm, he carried no assurance himself. The miners were less inclined to Scripture and more to whispers. They gathered outside the general store and spoke of curses on the land, of debts unpaid by those who came before. One man recounted a story his grandfather once told of settlers who vanished in these valleys, entire families swallowed without trace, leaving behind only charred timbers and fields gone fallow overnight. Perhaps, he suggested, the iron gate was raised to seal away the reason, to mark a threshold between what was safe and what was not. His companions muttered agreement, spitting into the dirt, too uneasy to laugh it off. As the nights wore on, the screams returned again and again. Not every night, but often enough that sleep grew scarce, that lanterns burned longer into the dark. Each time the sound seemed to grow louder, closer, more insistent, until even the bravest men hesitated to leave their homes after dusk. Windows were nailed shut, children were forbidden from playing beyond sight of their mothers, and a mood of collective dread settled over Ashford Hollow. The once bustling rhythm of the town dulled, conversations reduced to whispers, eyes constantly darting toward the ridges. Every telling of the voices became more embellished, yet more desperate. Some insisted the screams carried a rhythm, like the rise and fall of chant, as though something was trying to communicate. Others believed the cries were warnings, that the valley itself was groaning in protest of something about to come. A few claimed to see figures in the distance when the screams began, shapes standing by the iron gate, too far to distinguish, too shadowed to be certain. These reports spread quickly, stoking the fire of fear until no one could say what was truth and what was panic. The voices became more than a sound. They became a presence. Even in daylight, people claimed to feel them lingering, vibrating faintly in the silence of their homes, echoing in the shafts of the mines. Work slowed as men grew distracted, their minds clouded with dread, their hands hesitant on tools. Some families began to whisper of leaving altogether, abandoning debts and belongings just to be free of the sound. Yet most stayed, bound by poverty, by duty, by the belief that if they endured long enough, the nightmare would pass. The iron gate, once a curiosity, now became the symbol of everything unspoken. No one approached it, yet everyone watched it, as though expecting at any moment the source of the screams to appear beyond its bars. Each time the voices tore through the valley, the people of Ashford Hollow listened together, united in fear, yet divided in belief. None able to agree on what they heard, but all certain that it was not of this earth. The morning after the second round of screams left Ashford Hollow trembling, the town's leaders gathered on the steps of the church to decide what should be done. They were not men prone to hesitation. Mine foremen, land agents, old veterans of wars past, men whose lives were spent issuing orders and expecting obedience. Yet when they sat in the rising heat of that July morning, the silence between them was thick, as if each waited for another to speak first. The preacher stood among them, pale and exhausted, his voice still raw from his sermon, while a dozen townsfolk lingered at a distance, straining to hear. What was decided there would shape whether the town remained in fear or acted against it. Finally, with a cough to clear his throat, the foreman declared that they must search the woods near the iron gate again, No town could survive with its people paralyzed by screams in the night. Something or someone was causing them, and it had to be found. By dusk that evening, a group of 10 men had been assembled, armed with rifles, lanterns, and axes. They were not volunteers so much as conscripts, pushed forward by wives who refused to spend another night listening to their children sob in terror. Among them were men hardened by coal and gunpowder, their faces streaked with soot, their hands calloused from years of labor. They gathered at the end of the dirt street where the road dissolved into wild brush, their lanterns glowing faintly in the rising mist. Behind them, the town watched in silence, dozens of eyes peering from porches, mothers clutching children to their skirts, old men chewing nervously on their pipes. The air itself seemed reluctant to stir, as though the land held its breath to see what would happen next. The search party moved forward, their boots crunching gravel and snapping twigs as they followed the faint trail toward the iron gate. Each man carried his fear in silence, masking it with gruff mutters or the deliberate clearing of a throat. The lanterns cast weak halos of yellow that pushed against the dark, but never far enough. Soon the town's lights faded behind them, swallowed by the ridge, leaving only the distant glow of stars overhead. The iron gate loomed ahead, its black frame barely visible against the tree line until the lantern light fell upon it. Glinting off rusted bars like the teeth of a great beast, they fanned out near the gate, sweeping the underbrush with their lights. The ground was disturbed, though not in ways they understood. Branches lay twisted, not broken as though trampled by boots, but bent backward unnaturally, as if something larger had pressed through without regard for shape or angle. Leaves were scattered in circles, their edges browned despite the dampness of the forest floor. The air hung heavy with a stench, sulfur some said, while others insisted it smelled of rot, the kind found when a shaft collapse unearthed the long-buried dead. One man gagged into his sleeve, the acrid taste clinging to his tongue even as he tried to spit it out. The foreman pressed the men forward, deeper into the woods beyond the gate, though unease slowed their steps. Lantern light danced across trees whose trunks bore strange markings, long gashes that cut deep into bark, angled too clean to be the work of animals. When they stopped to study them, the forest seemed to press closer, the silence broken only by the hiss of lantern flames. It was then that one of the men claimed to hear something faint, the echo of crying, distant but unmistakable. Another man swore he heard the sound too, though when they turned to follow it, the noise vanished as though it had never been. The group tightened, their rifles raised, yet nothing stirred in the undergrowth. As the hours dragged on, their nerves frayed. Some urged they return, insisting the screams would not be found by searching, that whatever plagued the town was not of flesh and bone. Others spat at the suggestion, unwilling to return empty-handed. They pressed deeper still, until the forest became nearly impenetrable, branches clawing at their arms and roots catching their boots. More than once the lantern light flickered and dimmed inexplicably, leaving them in sudden pockets of darkness that sent panic through the group. When one man's lamp shattered in his hand, glass falling to the earth without cause, the others swore they heard a whisper slip through the trees, low and quick, gone before it could be placed. They returned near dawn, exhausted, shaken, and no wiser than when they left. Their faces were drawn tight, their eyes hollow from what they had seen or what they imagined they saw in the woods. To the waiting town they spoke little, only muttering of twisted branches and foul smells, of marks carved into trees that no tool they owned could replicate. The preacher demanded answers, but none came. The only certainty they carried back with them was that whatever haunted Ashford Hollow was not human, and it did not wish to be found. The days that followed saw more attempts, though none with greater success. Small groups searched in daylight when the sun broke through the mist and lent some courage to their steps. Yet each time they found only the same signs: bent branches, strange scorch marks on stones, and an ever-present odor that clung to their clothes long after they returned. No tracks of animals or men were ever discovered. No footprints, no discarded belongings, nothing that explained the cries. The more they looked, the less sense it made, as though the forest itself resisted their intrusion. One man claimed the trees seemed to shift when they walked, that paths disappeared behind them, replaced by thickets where open ground had been moments before. His companions laughed nervously, but none dared to argue too strongly, for each had felt the same creeping disorientation. With every fruitless search, the town's fear deepened. At first they had hoped to uncover a vagrant, a wild animal, even a lost soul whose suffering could be ended by rescue or bullet. But with no source revealed, the screams grew larger in the imagination, feeding rumors and dread. Children whispered of spirits trapped beyond the iron gate, their voices escaping only at night. Old women claimed it was the curse of the mine, the earth crying out for the blood stolen from its depths. The men, too proud to admit their fear, grew restless, quick to anger, quick to drink. Even the strongest among them found themselves lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next cry to tear through the valley. The iron gate, once merely a relic, now became the epicenter of every suspicion. Families crossed themselves when walking near it, some refusing to even look at it as they passed. A few began leaving offerings at its base, candles, sprigs of herbs, small crosses carved from wood, as though such gestures could keep the voices at bay. These offerings were always gone by morning, though whether taken by animals, neighbors, or something else entirely, no one could say. The uncertainty only deepened the fear, until the gate stood not just as a barrier of iron, but as a symbol of the town's helplessness. Still, the leaders pressed on. For what choice did they have? To do nothing was to admit defeat, to surrender their families to a terror they could not name. And so, night after night they gathered parties, scouring the ridges and hollows, listening for faint echoes, sniffing at the air for that sharp sting of sulfur. And each night they returned with nothing but haunted faces and whispers that chilled the town more deeply than the screams themselves. For though they found no enemy, no beast or man to blame, they carried back the growing certainty that something was out there in the dark, and it did not wish to be found. As the weeks turned into months, Ashford Hollow found itself reshaped by the unseen force that tormented it. Life continued, because it had to, but beneath the routines of farming, mining, and church-going, a deep fracture spread through the community. The screams did not vanish. They returned unpredictably, sometimes twice in a week, sometimes only after long silences that almost convinced people they had stopped for good. And every time the cries pierced the night air, the town was reminded of its helplessness, reminded that no search party, no prayer, no gathering of lanterns could draw the source into the open. The iron gate itself transformed from a relic into something more sinister. Before the screams began, it had simply been an odd landmark, a rusting piece of iron left from some forgotten boundary marker. Now it became the nucleus of fear. Children were forbidden to go near it, and most adults obeyed that same caution without question. Some swore the gate had changed since the night the screams began, that the bars seemed darker, their outlines sharper, as if they had been forged anew in secret. Others claimed it hummed when touched, a faint vibration that no blacksmith could explain. Even those who laughed at such talk avoided walking past it alone, especially after dusk. The fear bled into daily life in ways both subtle and profound. Farmers who once worked their fields until sundown now abandoned them earlier, unwilling to be caught near the tree line when the last light faded. The mines, already dangerous, became suffocating when rumors spread that the same sulfurous smell found near the gate was seeping into the lower shafts. Some miners claimed to hear faint echoes underground, as though the screams had roots that burrowed through the very rock beneath their feet. Whether real or imagined, the idea unsettled them deeply. Men who once labored 10-hour shifts began calling off, forcing mine owners to cut production. The mine was the town's lifeblood. With it faltering, hunger soon nipped at the edges of every family's table. Religion, too, bore the weight of the mystery. At first, the preacher tried to rally the people, insisting the screams were a test of faith. But as nights dragged on without answers, his sermons grew strained, his voice cracking with doubt he could not conceal. Attendance swelled at the church, yet the mood was less hopeful than desperate. Women lit candles for protection. Men recited psalms under their breath as they worked, and children were made to memorize prayers they could shout in the dark, should the cries ever move closer to their homes. In corners of the community, whispers spread of older beliefs, carried from Europe or born in the mountains themselves. Charms made of iron nails, herbs burned in secrecy, salt poured across thresholds. Families who once mocked such practices now adopted them, for the fear of ridicule paled beside the terror of the unknown. The social fabric itself began to fray. Suspicion grew like rot between neighbors who had lived side by side for decades. Some believed the screams were the work of a person, someone within the town or living at its fringes, hiding behind the mask of the supernatural. A hermit who lived on the ridge was accused by more than one family. His cabin stoned by boys until he fled deeper into the woods. Others turned their suspicion inward, blaming outsiders who had come to work the mines, men with no roots in Ashford Hollow and no ties to its safety. Fights broke out in the saloon. Men brawling over accusations whispered in drink-soaked tones. Blood was spilled more than once, not by the hand of the unseen horror, but by neighbors turned enemies through fear. The women of the town bore the brunt of the nightly terror, for it was often in their arms that children screamed when the cries pierced the dark. Some mothers claimed the screams carried a strange familiarity, as if the voice belonged to a child itself calling out in pain. Others swore they heard a woman's tone woven through the cries, high and broken like someone mourning. These impressions varied from ear to ear, yet each added another layer of dread. If the cries belonged to a person, then who was it? If not a person, then what could so perfectly mimic human anguish? The ambiguity tormented them, for the mind cannot rest when it cannot decide whether it is facing a ghost, a beast, or the cruelty of men. Despite everything, there were moments of eerie calm. Weeks would sometimes pass without a single sound, and in those stretches the town dared to breathe again. Children played near the creek, farmers lingered longer in their fields, and the mine shafts rang once more with steady pickaxes. Yet always the calm felt fragile, as if draped like a thin sheet over something vast and restless beneath. No one trusted the silence. In fact, the longer the quiet lasted, the more unbearable the suspense became. When the screams inevitably returned, they seemed sharper, more violent, as though mocking the town's hope that they had been silenced for good. It was during one such return that the screams changed. Where before they had risen and fallen like distant cries for help, this time they came in a rhythm, almost like words shouted in a tongue no one could understand. The cadence shook people more deeply than the volume, for it suggested intention. If the cries had structure, then perhaps there was intelligence behind them, something thinking, something aware. Some townsfolk claimed they could make out names in the noise, their own or those of the dead. Others insisted the sound carried no meaning, that the human ear twisted it into patterns because the mind cannot bear randomness in the face of terror. Yet once the idea took hold, that the screams might be speaking, the fear in Ashford Hollow shifted from dread of a beast to dread of a presence. Merchants stopped passing through. Word of the haunted valley spread beyond West Virginia, carried on the lips of travelers and printed in small blurbs in regional papers. The outside world began to treat Ashford Hollow with suspicion, a place whispered about but avoided. Trade slowed, and with it the town's economy. Hunger deepened, poverty crept, and the sense of isolation grew suffocating. The people of Ashford Hollow felt abandoned, left to face their affliction alone. Some families packed wagons and left altogether, taking their chances in other towns, their farms left untended to weeds. For those who remained, leaving was not an option. They had too little to carry them elsewhere, or roots too deep to sever. It was in this climate of fear and isolation that superstition hardened into ritual. Nights of screaming were followed by mornings where offerings littered the iron gate. Coins, dolls, carved figures, food, and handwritten pleas. No one admitted leaving them, but everyone knew they came from desperate hands. When these offerings vanished, as they always did, the town split further in its interpretations. Some took it as proof that whatever haunted them accepted the gifts. Others muttered it was proof of human trickery, that someone was feeding the terror for their own ends. Neither explanation brought comfort, only further unease. Ashford Hollow, once a place of grit and hard work, was now a town defined by whispers and shadows. Its people walked with eyes lowered, their voices subdued even in daylight. The iron gate stood untouched at the edge of the woods, its iron bars blackened by years of weather yet somehow impervious, as though it would outlast them all, and always. Hanging like a pall over every meal, every prayer, every attempt at normalcy, was the same unspoken question. How long could a town survive when every scream in the night reminded them they were powerless to stop it? The winter of 1903 came down hard on Ashford Hollow, wrapping the valley in ice and silence. Yet even the snow could not smother the echoes that had plagued the town for nearly half a year. The screams continued, sometimes carried sharp across the frozen air, other times muffled beneath the weight of storm winds, but always present, always cruel. If anything, the cold sharpened their edge, stripping away the layers of cicadas, frogs, and rustling leaves that summer had provided as background noise. In winter there was nothing else, just the whistle of wind through hollow trees and, cutting through it, that unearthly cry. The people of the town huddled closer to their hearths, but firewood grew scarce, and with each scream, families pressed tighter together as though the closeness itself could keep the sound from reaching too deeply inside them. It was during this season that the town began to realize they were not only haunted, but changed. The screams had begun as an outside affliction, something imposed upon Ashford Hollow. But by winter's bite, the people carried the terror within them. Children dreamed of iron bars and woke shrieking. Men who once labored with stoic determination now startled at the creak of a floorboard, gripping their tools like weapons. Women clutched rosaries until the beads left marks in their palms, whispering prayers not only for safety but for release. The fabric of the community had thinned, frayed, until every thread threatened to snap. The iron gate, once a silent marker, had by now become the town's unwilling altar. More offerings gathered at its base than ever before. Candles that sputtered and died in the cold, little bundles of bread left to freeze, coins blackened by frost. At dawn they would be gone, as they always were, though no tracks marked the snow around the gate. It was as if the earth itself swallowed them. Some townsfolk saw this as proof of appeasement, a trade for peace that never came. Others whispered it was mockery, that whatever force lingered in the woods took their gifts only to laugh at the futility. The division deepened. Families who had once stood together in church pews now avoided each other in the street, accusing neighbors of not offering enough, of failing to pray with the proper words, of secretly welcoming the curse for their own gain. Then came the night the screams moved closer. Until that point, they had always felt distant, even if the sound rattled windows and set dogs to howling. But in early January, a night of bitter cold and black skies, the cries came not from the ridge, not from beyond the gate, but from the heart of the town itself. A farmer's wife fetching water from the well dropped her bucket when the sound rose from the street behind her, a piercing shriek so close it felt as though it split her skull. She swore later that she had seen a figure at the edge of her lantern's glow, tall and twisted, though others argued she was seeing tricks of frost and fear. Within moments, more voices echoed the sound, rolling through alleyways and between houses, filling the town until it seemed as though dozens of unseen mouths screamed in unison. Men burst from their homes with rifles, firing blindly into the dark, their shots cracking against the hills, but nothing answered except the fading echoes. After that night, no one felt safe, not even in their own homes. Families boarded windows, nailed doors with iron spikes, burned herbs on the threshold until the air inside their cabins turned acrid. The screams did not return so close again, but the damage was done. Children refused to sleep unless packed tightly beside their parents, and even then they trembled through the night. Men carried weapons not only outside but inside their houses, setting rifles by their beds. The preacher, worn thin by months of futile prayer, began to preach of judgment, of a punishment laid upon Ashford Hollow for sins unnamed. Yet his voice cracked as he said it, betraying the truth that even he no longer believed salvation would come. Rumors took on the weight of fact in those weeks. Some claimed the screams were the souls of miners lost long ago, buried in shafts never recovered, clawing their way back to the surface through the iron gate. Others whispered of a settler family murdered on that land before the town was built, their spirits bound forever to the forest. A darker rumor suggested a bargain gone wrong, that one of the town's own had once promised something to a force beyond understanding, and now the debt had come due. No one could agree, but all agreed on this. Ashford Hollow was no longer just a town in the mountains. It was a place marked, cursed, and set apart. Travelers avoided it altogether. Merchants no longer came, and its name became a warning muttered in nearby valleys. The turning point came when the town gathered, desperate to decide its fate. In February, with supplies running thin and tempers frayed to breaking, the leaders called every family to the church. Snow beat against the windows, muffling the world outside, while inside the air was thick with sweat and fear. Voices rose, some demanding the iron gate be torn down and cast into the river, others insisting that such defiance would only enrage whatever power lingered. Some proposed abandoning the town entirely, scattering to safer places, though many admitted they had no money, no kin elsewhere, nowhere to go. The argument stretched deep into the night until the walls themselves seemed to tremble with the weight of it. Then, as if to remind them of their helplessness, the screams erupted outside, so loud and so close they rattled the lanterns on the wall. Mothers clutched children. Men raised rifles, though no target could be seen, and in that moment, every soul in Ashford Hollow realized that no matter what they decided, the screams would decide for them. From then on, the town was not merely haunted but consumed. People left in small groups when they could, wagons loaded with what little they could carry, their cabins left behind to rot in the snow. Those who remained dwindled week by week, their lives narrowing to a rhythm of survival. Chop wood, gather water, pray the screams stayed distant. Yet even in their dwindling numbers, they were never free of the sound. The cries followed them in dreams, echoed in the ringing of a hammer, whispered in the wind curling through broken shutters. Ashford Hollow itself seemed to hollow out, its streets quieter each day, its homes darker each night, until only the iron gate remained unchanged, black, unyielding, standing sentinel at the edge of the woods as though waiting for the last light of human defiance to burn out. And so the town endured, not with hope, not even with faith, but with the numb persistence of those who could no longer imagine escape. The screams continued, a voice without a body, a torment without an end, shaping every thought, every heartbeat, until the very identity of Ashford Hollow was no longer coal or labor or community, but the memory of that endless unanswered cry. In the quiet ruins of Ashford Hollow's memory, one question lingers like a shadow too heavy to lift. What truly lay beyond the iron gate? Was it the voice of the dead, clawing back into the world of the living, or something far older, something that mocked human sorrow by wearing its sound? Tonight, you've walked with us through a town that unraveled not from what it could see, but from what it could not. And now the echo belongs to you. If these screams had torn through your own valley, would you have stood firm, lantern in hand, or would you have fled, leaving behind the only life you'd ever known? Tell us in the comments what you believe haunted Ashford Hollow. Was it superstition or a truth too terrible for history to admit? The voices of the past do not fade. They linger, waiting to be heard. By subscribing, you ensure you never miss the next descent into shadows, the next story buried beneath dust and silence. Every bell you ring, every word you leave behind strengthens this journey into the forgotten corridors of history where fact and fear entwine. So linger with us. Listen closely, because for every scream that faded into the night, another waits just beyond the gate to be uncovered in our next tale. Subscribe now, leave your thoughts, and step with us once more into the places where history refuses to rest.